The wind howled through the narrow valley as Ruth Reed pressed her back against the rough, wooden door of the general store, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The voices inside rose and fell in cruel waves of laughter, each word cutting deeper than the mountain cold that seeped through her threadbare shawl. "Please," she whispered to the unforgiving wood, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. "I just need work. Any work." But the door remained closed and the laughter continued, echoing off the snow-covered peaks that surrounded the small mining town of Cedar Ridge like silent sentinels. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the weight of desperation settle over her like a heavy blanket. 3 days she had been going from door to door, business to business, begging for any kind of employment that might keep her and her young daughter from starving. 3 days of rejection, mockery, and doors slammed in her face. The mountain town was unforgiving to those without connections, without family, without the protection of a husband's name. Ruth had learned this harsh lesson in the 2 months since her husband Thomas had died in the mine collapse that claimed 7 good men and left their families to fend for themselves in a world that had little patience for widows and orphans. She straightened her spine, drawing on reserves of strength she wasn't sure she possessed, and stepped away from the door. The main street of Cedar Ridge stretched before her, like a gauntlet she had already run too many times. The saloon, the blacksmith shop, the boarding house, the dry goods store, all places where she had already been turned away, with varying degrees of cruelty and indifference. The snow crunched beneath her worn boots as she made her way down the wooden sidewalk, past windows glowing with warm lamplight that seemed to mock her with their promise of comfort and security. Behind those windows, families gathered around tables laden with food, children played by crackling fires, and women went about their evening routines without the constant gnawing fear of destitution that had become Ruth's unwelcome companion. She paused outside the millinery shop, pressing her face close to the frost-covered glass to peer inside. Mrs. Henderson stood behind the counter, arranging ribbons and lace with the careful precision of someone who had never known want. Ruth had worked for her briefly when she first arrived in Cedar Ridge as a new bride, her fingers quick and sure with needle and thread. But that was before, when she had been Thomas Reed's wife, when she had belonged to someone, when she had a place in the rigid social hierarchy of the mountain town. The bell above the door chimed softly as Ruth pushed inside, the warmth hitting her face like a gentle slap. Mrs. Henderson looked up from her work, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to cold recognition in the space of a heartbeat. "We're closed," the older woman said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mrs. Henderson, please," Ruth began, stepping forward despite the warning in the woman's eyes. "I know we've spoken before, but I'm desperate. I can sew, I can clean, I can do whatever you need. My little Sarah, she's only 6, and we haven't eaten properly in days." Mrs. Henderson's face remained impassive, her hands continuing their methodical arrangement of merchandise as if Ruth hadn't spoken. "I told you before, I have no work for you. Times are hard for everyone. I'll work for half wages," Ruth pressed on, hating the pleading note that crept into her voice but unable to stop it. "A quarter wages, just enough to buy bread and milk for Sarah." The older woman finally looked up, her eyes cold as winter stones. "Do you think I'm running a charity? This is a business, not a refuge for every unfortunate soul who wanders through my door. Your husband should have provided better for you before he got himself killed in that mine." The words hit Ruth like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. She felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger, but she forced herself to remain standing, to keep her voice steady. "Thomas was a good man who worked hard to provide for his family. The mine collapse wasn't his fault." Mrs. Henderson sniffed dismissively. "Perhaps not, but that doesn't make it my responsibility to support his widow. You're young enough. Find yourself another husband if you want security. Though I suppose that might be difficult, given your circumstances." The implication hung in the air between them like a poison cloud. Ruth understood perfectly what the woman meant. What man would want to take on a penniless widow with a child to feed? What man would see her as anything other than a burden, a charity case? Damaged goods left behind by tragedy? I don't want charity, Ruth said quietly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. I want to work. I want to earn my keep. Then I suggest you try the saloon, Mrs. Henderson replied with a cruel smile. I hear they're always looking for girls willing to work hard for their money, though perhaps you should clean yourself up first. You look like something the cat dragged in. The words were like a slap across the face, designed to humiliate and degrade. Ruth felt the last of her composure crumble, tears threatening to spill over, despite her desperate attempts to maintain her dignity. She turned toward the door without another word, unwilling to give the woman the satisfaction of seeing her break down completely. The cold air hit her like a physical force as she stumbled back onto the sidewalk, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps that had nothing to do with the altitude. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Henderson's voice carrying through the thin walls as she spoke to someone else in the shop, probably sharing the story of the desperate widow who had dared to beg for work, turning Ruth's humiliation into entertainment for the town's gossips. She walked blindly down the street, no longer caring where her feet carried her, only knowing that she needed to move, to put distance between herself and the scene of her latest rejection. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Now they only served to remind her that another day was ending, another day without work, without money, without hope. The sound of laughter drew her attention to the saloon, its windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. Through the glass, she could see men gathered around tables, drinks in hand, their faces flushed with alcohol and good humor. For a moment, Mrs. Henderson's cruel suggestion echoed in her mind, and she wondered if she had the courage to walk through those swinging doors, to debase herself in whatever way necessary to earn enough money to feed her daughter. The thought made her stomach turn, but desperation had a way of making the unthinkable seem almost reasonable. She had heard whispers about women who worked in such places, women who had fallen so far from respectability that they had no choice but to sell whatever they had left to sell. Was that her fate? Was that what she had been reduced to? She was so lost in her dark thoughts that she didn't notice the figure approaching from the shadows until he was almost upon her. When she looked up, she found herself staring into the weathered face of a man she had seen around town but never spoken to. One of the mountain men who came down from the high country occasionally for supplies and news. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. His clothes were rough but clean, practical garments designed for life in the wilderness, rather than impressing the townspeople. There was something about him that seemed solid, dependable, like the mountains themselves, a quality that made Ruth acutely aware of her own fragile state. "You're Thomas Reed's widow," he said, his voice low and gravelly, as if he didn't use it often. Ruth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had no idea what this stranger wanted with her, but she was too tired and defeated to feel afraid. What more could happen to her that hadn't already happened? "I heard about what happened at the mine," he continued, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "I'm sorry for your loss." Thomas was a good man. The unexpected kindness in his voice nearly undid her completely. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with genuine sympathy, without judgment or pity or cruel amusement. She blinked rapidly, trying to keep the tears at bay. "Thank you," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible above the wind. The man, she thought his name was Daniel Peterson, though she couldn't be certain, continued to study her with those storm-gray eyes. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read, a thoughtfulness that suggested he was weighing his words carefully. "You've been looking for work," he said. It wasn't a question. Ruth's cheeks burned with embarrassment. Of course he had heard about her desperate attempts to find employment. In a town the size of Cedar Ridge, everyone knew everyone else's business, especially when that business involved public humiliation. "Yes," she said simply, lifting her chin despite her shame. "I have a daughter to feed." Daniel nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "The town's not been kind to you." Again, it wasn't a question, and Ruth didn't bother to answer. The evidence of the town's treatment was written all over her. In her threadbare clothes, her hollow cheeks, the desperate look in her eyes that she couldn't quite hide, no matter how hard she tried. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind whistling between the buildings and stirring up small whirlwinds of snow. Ruth found herself studying this strange man, who had appeared out of nowhere, to offer her the first genuine sympathy she had received in weeks. There was something about him that seemed different from the other men in town. Less concerned with appearances, less bound by the social conventions that governed life in Cedar Ridge. "I have a cabin up in the high country," Daniel said finally, his words careful and measured. "It's not fancy, but it's warm and dry. There's plenty of game in the mountains, and I grow what vegetables I can in the short growing season. I could use someone to help with the cooking and cleaning, someone to tend the garden and preserve the food for winter." Ruth's heart began to beat faster, hope flickering to life in her chest like a candle flame in the wind. "You're offering me work?" "I'm offering you and your daughter a home," Daniel said quietly, "if you're willing." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Ruth understood what he was suggesting. Not just employment, but something more permanent, more intimate. The idea should have frightened her. The thought of going off into the wilderness with a man she barely knew, leaving behind the familiar cruelties of town life for the unknown dangers of the mountains. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that had been absent from every other face she had encountered in her desperate search for work: respect. He wasn't looking at her as a charity case or a burden, or a woman fallen so low that she could be treated with contempt. He was looking at her as a person, as someone with value, as someone worthy of consideration and care. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you help me?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the mountains that loomed around them like sleeping giants. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was unused to explaining himself. "I've been alone up there for 3 years," he said. "It's a hard life, but it's honest. Clean. Away from all this." He gestured vaguely at the town around them, encompassing in that single motion all the pettiness and cruelty that had driven Ruth to the edge of despair. "But it gets lonely," he continued, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it above the wind. "And I've watched what this town does to people like you. Good people who deserve better than what they're getting. I figure we might be able to help each other." Ruth felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of despair or frustration. This man, this stranger, was offering her something she had begun to think no longer existed in the world: genuine kindness without strings attached, help without humiliation, a chance to rebuild her life with dignity intact. "My daughter," she said, thinking of 6-year-old Sarah waiting back at the boarding house where they had been staying on credit that was rapidly running out. "She's never lived anywhere but town." "Children adapt," Daniel said with a slight smile that transformed his weathered face. "And the mountains are good for young ones. Teaches them to be strong, to be self-reliant. She'd have fresh air and clean water, plenty of space to run and play. It's not an easy life, but it's a good one." Ruth closed her eyes, trying to imagine it. A cabin in the mountains, away from the whispers and stares and cruel laughter of the townspeople. A place where she could work with her hands, contribute something meaningful, raise her daughter in peace and dignity. It seemed almost too good to be true, and yet the man standing before her radiated a sincerity that was impossible to doubt. "When?" she asked, opening her eyes to meet his steady gaze. "Tomorrow morning, if you're willing," Daniel replied. "I came down for supplies, and I'll be heading back up at first light. You can bring whatever you have, whatever you can carry. The cabin's furnished with the basics, and what we don't have, we can make or do without." The decision should have been difficult, should have required careful consideration and weighing of options. But Ruth had no options left to weigh. The town had made it clear that she was not welcome, that her presence was an embarrassment and her need for work an inconvenience. She could continue to debase herself, begging for scraps of employment from people who looked at her with contempt. Or she could take this leap of faith with a man who offered her something precious beyond measure: hope. "Yes," she said, the word coming out stronger than she had expected. "Yes, I'll come with you." Daniel nodded, as if he had expected no other answer. "Meet me at the livery stable at dawn. Bring whatever you can carry, but don't worry about food. I've got supplies for the journey." He turned to go, then paused, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "And Mrs. Reed, you might want to avoid mentioning this to anyone in town. Some folks here don't take kindly to people finding ways out of the holes they've dug for them." With that cryptic warning, he melted back into the shadows as quietly as he had emerged, leaving Ruth standing alone on the sidewalk with her heart pounding and her mind racing. She looked around at the town that had shown her nothing but cruelty and rejection, at the windows glowing with warmth she would never be invited to share, at the streets where she had walked in desperation and humiliation. Tomorrow she would leave it all behind. Tomorrow she would take her daughter and disappear into the mountains with a man who saw her as more than just another burden to be cast aside. The thought filled her with a mixture of terror and exhilaration that made her feel more alive than she had in months. She turned and walked back toward the boarding house where Sarah waited, her steps lighter than they had been in weeks. Behind her, the town continued its evening routines, oblivious to the fact that one of its cast-offs had just been offered salvation by the most unlikely of saviors. The boarding house was a narrow three-story building wedged between the bank and the telegraph office. Its rooms small and cramped, but mercifully cheap. Ruth climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor, her hand trailing along the worn banister as she made her way to the tiny room she shared with Sarah. She found her daughter curled up on the narrow bed, a picture book open in her lap, one of the few possessions they had managed to salvage from their former life. Sarah looked up as her mother entered, her blue eyes bright with the resilience that only children seem to possess. "Mama, did you find work today?" Sarah asked, her voice hopeful, despite the disappointment she had faced so many times before. Ruth sat down on the edge of the bed and gathered her daughter into her arms, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, marveling at how good it felt to finally give her child good news. "I found work. We're going to go live in the mountains with a nice man who needs help taking care of his home." Sarah's eyes widened with excitement. "In the mountains? Will there be animals?" "Lots of animals," Ruth said, smiling at her daughter's enthusiasm. "Deer and rabbits and maybe even bears, though we'll stay far away from those, and you'll have a whole mountainside to explore." "When do we go?" Sarah asked, bouncing slightly on the bed. "Tomorrow morning, very early," Ruth replied. "So we need to pack tonight. We can only take what we can carry, so we'll have to choose carefully." They spent the next hour going through their meager possessions, deciding what was essential and what could be left behind. Ruth packed their few changes of clothes, Sarah's picture book, a small sewing kit that had belonged to her mother, and a tin-type photograph of Thomas that she couldn't bear to abandon. Everything else, the few pieces of furniture they had managed to keep, the dishes and household items that had once seemed so important, would have to stay. As they worked, Ruth found herself thinking about Daniel Peterson and his unexpected offer. She knew almost nothing about him beyond his name and reputation as one of the mountain men who lived in the high country. She had heard whispers that he was a former soldier, that he had come west after the war to escape memories too painful to bear. Others said he was running from the law, though no one seemed to know what crime he might have committed. But as Ruth remembered the way he had looked at her, with respect and genuine concern rather than pity or judgment, she found that she didn't care about the rumors and speculation. Whatever had driven Daniel Peterson to the mountains, whatever secrets he might be carrying, he had shown her more kindness in 10 minutes than the entire town of Cedar Ridge had shown her in 2 months. The night passed slowly, Ruth lying awake listening to Sarah's steady breathing and trying to quiet her racing thoughts. Part of her wondered if she was making a terrible mistake, trusting her and her daughter's lives to a virtual stranger. But the larger part, the part that had been ground down by weeks of rejection and humiliation, knew that anything was better than staying in a place where she was seen as nothing more than an unwanted burden. When the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the small window, Ruth rose quietly and gathered their packed belongings. Sarah woke without complaint, her excitement about their adventure overriding any drowsiness. They dressed quickly in their warmest clothes and crept down the stairs, leaving the key to their room on the front desk, along with a note explaining that they were leaving town. The streets were empty as they made their way to the livery stable, their breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. Ruth felt a strange sense of liberation as they walked past the familiar buildings, the general store where she had been turned away, the millinery shop where she had been humiliated, the saloon where desperate thoughts had briefly taken root. All of it was behind her now, part of a chapter in her life that was finally coming to a close. Daniel was waiting for them at the stable, standing beside a sturdy mountain horse loaded with supplies. He had changed from his town clothes into the practical gear of a man who lived in the wilderness. Heavy boots, wool pants, a thick coat that looked like it could turn away both wind and rain. When he saw them approaching, he touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Mrs. Reed, Sarah," his voice was warm as he addressed the little girl, who had hidden shyly behind her mother's skirts. "Are you ready for an adventure?" Sarah peeked out from behind Ruth, her curiosity overcoming her bashfulness. "Are we really going to live in the mountains?" "We are indeed," Daniel said, crouching down to her level. "Have you ever seen snow-capped peaks up close? Or watched eagles soar overhead? Or heard the sound a mountain stream makes as it tumbles over rocks?" Sarah shook her head, her eyes growing wide with wonder. "Well, you're going to see and hear all of that and more," Daniel said with a gentle smile. "But first, we have a long ride ahead of us. Think you can handle sitting in a saddle for most of the day?" "I think so," Sarah said, though Ruth could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Her daughter had never been on a horse before, had never been outside the boundaries of Cedar Ridge. Daniel seemed to sense her nervousness. "Don't worry," he said. "You'll be riding with your mother, and I'll make sure you're both safe every step of the way." He helped them mount the second horse he had brought, a gentle mare with kind eyes and a steady temperament. Ruth settled into the saddle with Sarah in front of her, her arms wrapped securely around her daughter. It had been years since she had ridden, but the familiar feel of the horse beneath her brought back memories of her childhood on her father's farm, when the world had seemed full of possibilities rather than closed doors. As they rode out of town, Ruth looked back once at the place that had been her home for such a brief, painful time. Already it seemed smaller, less significant, as if distance was stripping away its power to hurt her. The sun was rising over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. And for the first time in months, Ruth felt something that had become foreign to her: hope. The trail led steadily upward, winding through stands of pine and aspen that grew thicker as they climbed. The air grew thinner and colder, but it was clean and pure in a way that the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge had never been. Sarah pointed excitedly at every bird and squirrel they encountered, her fear forgotten in the wonder of discovery. Daniel rode slightly ahead, his posture relaxed but alert, his eyes constantly scanning the trail and the surrounding forest. He was clearly at home in this environment in a way that few men were at home anywhere. This was his domain, Ruth realized, not the cramped streets and social hierarchies of town life, but the vast, untamed wilderness where a man's worth was measured by his skills and character rather than his connections or bank account. They stopped at midday beside a small stream that chuckled and gurgled as it wound its way down the mountainside. Daniel helped them dismount and unpacked a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried meat. Sarah was fascinated by everything: the way the water caught the sunlight, the sound the wind made in the pine boughs, the tracks left by various animals in the soft earth beside the stream. "What made those?" she asked, pointing to a set of prints in the mud. "Deer," Daniel said, examining the tracks with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read the forest like a book. "A doe and her fawn, I'd guess. They came down to drink early this morning." Sarah looked around with wide eyes, as if expecting to see the deer emerge from the trees at any moment. Ruth watched her daughter's excitement with a mixture of joy and trepidation. This was so different from the life she had planned for Sarah. A life in town with proper schooling and social connections, and all the advantages that civilization was supposed to provide. But as she watched her daughter's face light up with genuine wonder, Ruth began to think that perhaps there were other kinds of education, other ways to prepare a child for the world. "How much farther?" Ruth asked as they prepared to resume their journey. "Another few hours," Daniel replied, checking the position of the sun. "We'll reach the cabin well before dark." The afternoon passed in a blur of spectacular scenery: towering peaks that seemed to scrape the sky, valleys carpeted with wildflowers, streams that sparkled like silver ribbons in the sunlight. Ruth found herself relaxing, despite her lingering nervousness about their destination. There was something about the mountains that seemed to put everything in perspective, to make the petty cruelties and social hierarchies of town life seem small and insignificant. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, they crested a ridge, and Daniel pointed ahead to a small valley nestled between two towering mountains. There, in a clearing beside a crystal-clear lake, stood a log cabin that looked like something from a fairy tale. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, and Ruth could see a vegetable garden laid out in neat rows beside the building. "Home," Daniel said simply, and Ruth felt her heart skip a beat at the word. The cabin was larger than she had expected, built from massive logs that spoke of permanence and solidity. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and she could see rocking chairs positioned to take advantage of the spectacular view. Everything about the place spoke of careful planning and attention to detail, of a man who had built not just a shelter, but a real home. Daniel helped them dismount and began unloading their few possessions. "I'll show you around," he said, "but first, let's get you settled. You must be tired from the ride." He led them up the steps to the porch, and Ruth noticed that the boards were smooth and well-maintained, without the splinters and rough patches that might catch a dress or injure a child. The front door was heavy and solid, with a simple but effective lock, protection against both weather and any unwelcome visitors who might venture this far into the wilderness. Inside, the cabin was a revelation. The main room was spacious and comfortable, with a large stone fireplace that dominated one wall and windows that looked out over the lake and mountains. The furniture was handmade but well-crafted. A large table surrounded by chairs, comfortable seating arranged around the fireplace, shelves lined with books and practical items. Everything was clean and orderly, speaking of a man who took pride in his surroundings, despite his isolation. "There are 2 bedrooms," Daniel said, gesturing toward a hallway that led toward the back of the cabin. "You and Sarah can have the larger one. I'll take the smaller room." Ruth felt a flush of embarrassment as she realized the implications of the arrangement. She had been so focused on escaping Cedar Ridge and finding work that she hadn't fully considered the intimate nature of sharing a home with a man she barely knew. But Daniel's matter-of-fact tone and respectful demeanor helped ease her discomfort. Whatever his motivations for bringing them here, it was clear that he intended to behave as a gentleman. Sarah had no such concerns. She ran from room to room, exclaiming over everything she saw: the big bed with its colorful quilt, the window that looked out over the lake, the shelves filled with interesting objects that begged to be explored. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Ruth found herself smiling despite her nervousness. "It's beautiful," she said to Daniel, meaning it. "You've built something wonderful here." He looked pleased by her approval, though he tried to hide it. "It's taken me 3 years to get it the way I want it. There's still work to be done. Always is, in a place like this. But it's comfortable enough." As evening fell, Daniel prepared a simple but satisfying dinner, while Ruth and Sarah explored their new surroundings. The kitchen was well equipped with everything needed for cooking and food preparation, and Ruth could see that Daniel was a man who understood the importance of good meals and maintaining morale during the long mountain winters. They ate by lamplight, the conversation stilted at first, but gradually becoming more comfortable as the meal progressed. Sarah chattered about everything she had seen during the day, her excitement undiminished by fatigue. Daniel listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he understood how overwhelming the day must have been for a child who had never been outside of town. After dinner, Ruth helped clean up, while Daniel banked the fire for the night. The domestic routine felt strange after months of uncertainty and transience, but also comforting in a way she hadn't expected. When was the last time she had felt truly safe, truly at home? Not since Thomas's death, certainly, and perhaps not for some time before that. "I want to be clear about our arrangement," Daniel said as they finished the evening chores. "You're not my employee, Mrs. Reed. You're my partner in making this place work. I'll provide for you and Sarah, keep you safe, give you a home. In return, you'll help with the cooking and cleaning and garden work, the things that make a house a home rather than just a place to sleep." Ruth nodded, understanding the distinction he was making. This wasn't charity or employment in the traditional sense. It was a partnership, a mutual agreement between equals who each brought something valuable to the arrangement. And if it doesn't work out, she asked quietly, if we find we can't live together peacefully? Daniel was quiet for a moment, staring into the dying fire. Then I'll take you back to town or wherever else you want to go. I won't force you to stay anywhere you don't want to be. The promise eased something in Ruth's chest that she hadn't even realized was tight with worry. She had been so desperate to escape Cedar Ridge that she hadn't fully considered what would happen if this arrangement proved untenable. Knowing that she wasn't trapped, that she retained some control over her own destiny, made all the difference in the world. That night, as she tucked Sarah into the big bed in their new room, her daughter looked up at her with sleepy eyes. I like it here, Mama, she said. It's quiet, but it's a good quiet. Not like the scary quiet in town when people stop talking when we walk by. Ruth's heart clenched at the reminder that her 6-year-old daughter had been aware of the town's hostility, had felt the weight of their rejection, even at her young age. Yes, sweetheart, she said, smoothing Sarah's hair back from her forehead. It's a very good quiet. As Sarah drifted off to sleep, Ruth sat by the window looking out over the moonlit lake. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the stars like a mirror, and the mountains rose around them like protective walls. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the haunting call of a loon, a sound both wild and peaceful that seemed to sum up everything about their new home. She thought about the events that had brought her to this place, Thomas's death, the struggle to survive in Cedar Ridge, the humiliation and rejection she had faced at every turn. It had all seemed so hopeless just 24 hours ago, as if she and Sarah were doomed to a slow slide into destitution and despair. And then Daniel Peterson had appeared out of the shadows like an answer to a prayer she hadn't even known she was praying. Why had he done it? What had motivated him to offer sanctuary to a desperate widow and her child? Ruth suspected there was more to his story than he had revealed, depths and complexities that would only emerge with time. But for now, it was enough that he had offered them safety and dignity when no one else would. The next few days passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. Ruth threw herself into the work of making the cabin truly comfortable, cleaning and organizing and adding small touches that transformed the space from a bachelor's retreat into a family home. She discovered that Daniel was an excellent cook but had been living on a limited repertoire of simple meals. Her own cooking skills, refined during her brief marriage to Thomas, brought new variety and flavor to their table. Sarah adapted to mountain life with the resilience of childhood, turning the forest into her playground and the lake into her private ocean. She learned to identify animal tracks, to spot eagles soaring overhead, to move quietly through the woods without disturbing the wildlife. Daniel proved to be a patient teacher, sharing his knowledge of the wilderness with the same matter-of-fact generosity he had shown in offering them a home. As the days turned into weeks, Ruth began to understand why Daniel had chosen this life. There was a peace in the mountains that she had never experienced in town, a sense of being connected to something larger and more enduring than the petty concerns of human society. The work was hard but satisfying, tending the garden, preserving food for winter, maintaining the cabin and its surroundings. Every task had a clear purpose. Every day brought tangible accomplishments that contributed to their collective well-being. But it was the gradual development of trust and companionship between herself and Daniel that surprised Ruth the most. She had expected their relationship to remain formal and distant, a business arrangement between strangers thrown together by circumstances. Instead, she found herself looking forward to their evening conversations by the fire, to the quiet moments when they worked side by side in comfortable silence, to the rare occasions when Daniel's reserved facade cracked enough to reveal glimpses of the man beneath. He was, she discovered, far more educated than his rough appearance suggested. The shelves in the cabin were filled with books on subjects ranging from philosophy to natural science, and his conversation revealed a mind that had been shaped by both formal education and hard experience. He had indeed been a soldier, she learned gradually, an officer in the Union Army who had seen more than his share of death and suffering. The mountains had been his refuge from memories that still haunted his dreams. I came up here to be alone, he told her one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Figured I was done with people, done with trying to fit into a world that didn't make sense anymore. What changed your mind? Ruth asked softly. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "Watching what that town did to you," he said finally. "Seeing good people ground down by others who should have known better. I realized that hiding up here wasn't solving anything. It was just another kind of cowardice." Ruth felt her heart skip at his words, at the implication that he saw her as worth saving, worth the risk of opening his carefully guarded world to others. "I'm grateful," she said, "more grateful than I can express. You gave us back our lives when I thought they were over." "You gave me back mine too," Daniel replied quietly. "I just didn't realize how empty this place was until you and Sarah filled it with life." The admission hung between them, heavy with meaning that neither was quite ready to acknowledge fully. But Ruth felt something shift in that moment, a recognition that what had begun as a practical arrangement was becoming something deeper and more complex. As autumn approached, bringing with it the knowledge that winter in the mountains would test their small family in ways that the gentle summer months had not, Ruth found herself thinking more and more about the future. What would happen when the snows came and they were truly isolated, dependent on each other not just for companionship, but for survival itself? What would happen when spring returned and the outside world became accessible again? Would she and Sarah stay, or would they return to the lowlands and the conventional life she had once thought she wanted? The questions became more pressing as the first snows began to dust the higher peaks and the days grew shorter. Daniel began the serious work of winter preparation, cutting and stacking firewood, checking and rechecking their food supplies, making repairs to the cabin that would see them through the harsh months ahead. Ruth threw herself into the work of preserving the garden's harvest, canning vegetables and fruits that would provide essential nutrition during the long winter. It was during this time of intense preparation that the first real test of their arrangement came. Ruth was working in the kitchen one afternoon, steam rising from the large pot where she was processing the last of the green beans, when she heard the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his face grim, a rifle in his hands. "Take Sarah and go to the back bedroom," he said quietly. "Lock the door and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Ruth felt her blood turn to ice. In all their weeks in the mountains, they had seen no other human beings, had existed in a world that seemed to contain only themselves and the wildlife. The sudden appearance of strangers felt like a violation, a reminder that even here, in this remote sanctuary, they were not completely safe from the outside world. She gathered Sarah quickly, explaining in whispers that they needed to play a hiding game, that they must be very quiet until Papa Daniel said it was safe to come out. The word Papa had slipped out without thought, a reflection of how naturally Sarah had come to see Daniel as a father figure in the absence of her own. From the back bedroom, Ruth could hear voices, Daniel's calm and steady, others that were rougher, more aggressive. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she held Sarah close, trying to project calm while her mind raced through terrible possibilities. The voices grew louder, more heated, and Ruth heard the scrape of boots on the porch, the creak of the front door opening. Strangers were in their home, in the sanctuary that had felt so safe and secure just moments before. She pressed her ear to the bedroom door, straining to hear what was happening. "We know she's here, Peterson," one of the voices said. "Saw the tracks, saw the smoke from 2 chimneys instead of 1. You can't hide her forever." "I'm not hiding anyone," Daniel replied, his voice carefully controlled. "This is my home, and you're not welcome in it." "Your home, maybe," another voice chimed in, "but that woman belongs in town, answering for what she's done. You can't just steal a man's property and expect there to be no consequences." Ruth's blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. Someone from Cedar Ridge had tracked them down, had come to drag her back to face some imagined crime or debt. But what could they possibly accuse her of? She had left owing nothing but a few dollars to the boarding house, had taken nothing that didn't belong to her. "Mrs. Reed is under my protection," Daniel said, and there was something in his voice that made Ruth's heart skip, a quiet authority that brooked no argument. "She's done nothing wrong, and she's not going anywhere with you." "Protection?" The first voice laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Is that what you call it? Taking up with another man's woman before her husband's even cold in the ground?" The accusation hit Ruth like a physical blow. They were implying that she had been unfaithful to Thomas, that her relationship with Daniel was something sordid and shameful. The injustice of it made her want to rush out and defend herself, but she forced herself to stay hidden, to trust that Daniel could handle the situation. Thomas Reed has been dead for 3 months, Daniel said, his voice deadly quiet. His widow has every right to make her own choices about her future, and she's chosen to stay here, with me. Chosen? The voice was mocking now. What choice does a penniless widow have? You took advantage of her desperation, Peterson. That makes you no better than the men who frequent the saloons. Ruth heard the sound of a chair scraping across the floor, then Daniel's voice, closer now, and vibrating with barely controlled anger. You have 10 seconds to get out of my house before I demonstrate just how wrong you are about my character. And if you ever come here again, if you ever threaten Mrs. Reed or her daughter, I'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your very short lives. There was a moment of tense silence, then the sound of boots moving toward the door. This isn't over, Peterson, one of the men said. The town has a long memory, and we don't forget when people thumb their noses at decent society. Neither do I, Daniel replied, and I remember every face that turned away when a good woman needed help. Now get off my land before I lose what's left of my patience. Ruth waited until she heard the sound of horses riding away before she unlocked the bedroom door and emerged with Sarah. Daniel was standing by the window, his rifle still in his hands, watching the retreating figures disappear into the forest. When he turned to face her, she could see the anger still burning in his eyes. Who were they? She asked, though she suspected she already knew. Henderson and Morrison, Daniel replied, naming two of the town's more prominent citizens. They seemed to think they had some claim on you, some right to drag you back to face their judgment. Ruth felt sick to her stomach. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had refused her work and suggested she try the saloon, had sent men to bring her back. But why? What possible interest could the town have in a woman they had been so eager to reject? They said I had done something wrong, Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper. What could they possibly accuse me of? Daniel set the rifle aside and moved toward her, his expression softening as he saw her distress. It doesn't matter what they accuse you of, he said firmly. You're not going back there. This is your home now, and I'll protect it, and you, with my life if necessary. The declaration sent warmth flooding through Ruth's chest, a feeling of security and belonging that she had never experienced before. This man, who had started as a stranger offering practical help, had just declared himself willing to die for her and Sarah. The magnitude of that commitment took her breath away. Why? She asked, echoing the question she had posed on that first night in town. Why would you risk so much for us? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. When he spoke, his voice was soft but certain. Because somewhere along the way, you stopped being a responsibility and became the most important thing in my world, he said. You and Sarah, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. A reason to care about tomorrow, a reason to build something instead of just surviving. Ruth felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. In the months since Thomas's death, she had felt like half a person, incomplete and adrift in a world that seemed to have no place for her. But here, in this remote mountain cabin with this quiet, strong man, she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. A sense of wholeness, of belonging, of being valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. Daniel, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. You don't have to say anything, he said. I know this is complicated. Know you're still grieving Thomas. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just wanted you to know where I stand. Wanted you to understand that this isn't temporary for me. You and Sarah are part of my life now, permanently if you'll have me. Ruth felt her heart swell with an emotion she had thought she would never experience again. It wasn't the desperate, passionate love she had felt for Thomas in their brief courtship and marriage. This was something deeper, more mature, a love built on respect and shared hardship and the gradual recognition of compatibility and mutual support. Yeah, she said simply. Yes, we'll have you. The words seemed to release something in both of them, a tension that had been building for weeks finally finding resolution. Daniel stepped closer, his hand reaching up to cup her cheek with a gentleness that made her heart flutter. For a moment, Ruth thought he might kiss her, and she realized that she wanted him to, that she was ready to take that step toward a new kind of happiness. But before either of them could move, Sarah's voice broke the spell. "Mama, who were those men? Why did they want to take us away?" Ruth turned to her daughter, seeing the confusion and fear in her young face. Sarah had heard enough of the confrontation to understand that strangers had come to their home with bad intentions, but she was too young to grasp the full implications of what had happened. "They were just confused people who thought we belonged somewhere else," Ruth explained, kneeling down to Sarah's level. "But Daniel explained to them that this is our home now, and they went away." "Will they come back?" Sarah asked, her small hand clutching at Ruth's skirt. "No, sweetheart," Daniel said, his voice gentle but firm. "They won't come back, I promise." It was a promise Ruth hoped he could keep, but she knew that the confrontation had changed something fundamental about their situation. They were no longer simply hiding from the world. The world had found them, had made it clear that it would not let them disappear quietly into the wilderness. Whatever peace they had found in the mountains, it would have to be defended. As winter settled over the high country in earnest, bringing with it snow that measured in feet rather than inches, in temperatures that could kill the unprepared, Ruth found herself grateful for the enforced isolation. The confrontation with the men from town had shaken her more than she cared to admit, had reminded her that there were people who saw her happiness as a personal affront to their sense of moral order. But as the weeks passed and no further threats materialized, she began to relax into the rhythm of winter life in the mountains. The cabin became a warm, bright refuge against the howling storms that raged outside. Daniel proved to be excellent company during the long evenings, reading aloud from his extensive library or teaching Sarah to play chess by the fireplace. Ruth found herself falling into domestic routines that felt natural and comfortable, cooking elaborate meals to ward off the monotony of preserved foods, mending clothes and household items, working on a quilt that would add both warmth and beauty to their home. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as snow pattered against the windows and the fire crackled in the hearth, that Ruth realized something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with Daniel. She no longer thought of him as her benefactor or protector, but as her partner in the truest sense of the word. They shared the work of maintaining their household, made decisions together about everything from meal planning to home improvements, supported each other through the small frustrations and larger challenges that arose in their isolated life. More than that, she had come to depend on his presence in ways that went beyond the practical. His quiet strength anchored her when doubts crept in about their unconventional life. His dry sense of humor lightened the mood when cabin fever threatened to set in. His genuine interest in Sarah's education and development made Ruth feel that her daughter was being raised by two parents rather than a single mother struggling alone. One evening in late January, as they sat by the fire after Sarah had gone to bed, Daniel looked up from the book he was reading and caught Ruth watching him. There was something in his expression that made her pulse quicken, a warmth that went beyond mere companionship. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed to be caught staring. "I was thinking about how different this is from what I expected when we first came here," she said honestly. "I thought it would be temporary, a place to stay until I could figure out what to do next. I never imagined it would feel so much like home." Daniel set his book aside and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "And now? Now I can't imagine being anywhere else," Ruth admitted. "This life, this place, you and Sarah and me, it feels right in a way that nothing has felt right since Thomas died." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "I need to tell you something," he said finally. "Something I should have told you months ago." Ruth felt her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. Was he about to reveal some dark secret that would shatter the peace they had built together? "What is it?" "I'm in love with you," he said simply. "I have been for weeks, maybe months. I tried to tell myself it was just gratitude or companionship or the natural result of living in close quarters. But I can't pretend anymore. I love you, Ruth. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you've made this house into a home. I love watching you with Sarah. Love the sound of your voice and the way you hum while you work. I love everything about you, and I needed you to know." Ruth felt her breath catch in her throat. She had sensed the growing depth of feeling between them, had felt her own heart opening to possibilities she had thought were closed to her forever. But hearing the words spoken aloud, seeing the vulnerability in Daniel's eyes as he waited for her response, made everything suddenly real and immediate. "Daniel," she began, then stopped, unsure how to put her own feelings into words. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I know it's complicated. Know you might not be ready for this. I just couldn't keep it to myself any longer." "No," Ruth said, finding her voice at last. "I do need to say something. I need to tell you that I love you too." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, transforming the familiar space of their living room into something charged with new possibility. Daniel's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't dared to hope for such a response. "I didn't think I could love anyone again," Ruth continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over, that I would spend whatever years I had left just surviving, just getting by. But you've shown me that there are different kinds of love, that it's possible to build something new without betraying what came before." Daniel rose from his chair and moved to the couch where Ruth was sitting, settling beside her with careful deliberation. "I want to marry you," he said quietly, "not because it's the proper thing to do or because you need protection, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Will you have me, Ruth? Will you be my wife?" Ruth felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. The proposal was everything she could have hoped for, not a desperate arrangement born of necessity, but a genuine declaration of love from a man who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I'll marry you." Daniel's face lit up with a smile that transformed his usually serious features, making him look years younger. He reached for her hands, enfolding them in his larger, calloused ones, and Ruth felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a warm blanket. "When?" he asked. Ruth laughed, suddenly giddy with happiness. "Whenever you want, though I suppose we'll have to wait until spring to have any kind of ceremony. Unless you know a preacher who makes house calls in blizzards." "There's a circuit preacher who comes through the high country in late spring," Daniel said. "We could have him perform the ceremony here, by the lake, with the mountains as witnesses." The image was so perfect, so exactly what Ruth would have chosen if she had been brave enough to dream of such happiness, that she felt her heart might burst with joy. "That sounds wonderful," she said. Daniel leaned forward then, his hand cupping her cheek in the gentle gesture that had become familiar between them. This time, there were no interruptions, no reasons to hesitate. When his lips met hers, Ruth felt the last of her reservations melt away, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. The kiss was gentle and reverent, a promise of the partnership they were choosing to build together. When they broke apart, Ruth rested her forehead against Daniel's, breathing in the scent of pine and wood smoke that always seemed to cling to him. "I love you," she whispered, marveling at how natural the words felt. "I love you too," he replied, "more than I ever thought possible." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to glowing embers, both lost in thoughts of the future they would build together. Ruth felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced before, not the desperate relief of escape from Cedar Ridge, not the grateful contentment of finding sanctuary, but the deep satisfaction of knowing she was exactly where she belonged. Spring came late to the high country that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a transformation that seemed to mirror Ruth's own journey from despair to joy. The snow melted to reveal meadows carpeted with wildflowers. The lake thawed to reflect the brilliant blue of the mountain sky. And the forest came alive with the songs of returning birds. Ruth threw herself into preparations for their wedding with an enthusiasm that surprised even herself. She had been married before, had experienced the excitement of planning a wedding and dreaming of a shared future. But this felt different, more mature, more grounded in reality, more precious because she understood how easily it could be lost. She worked on her wedding dress in the evenings, altering one of her few good dresses with lace and ribbons that Daniel had somehow procured during one of his supply runs to a distant town. Sarah helped with the preparations, her excitement infectious as she planned the flowers she would pick and the special meal they would prepare for the occasion. When the circuit preacher finally arrived in late May, he found a couple who radiated the kind of happiness that comes from having weathered storms together and emerged stronger for the experience. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, conducted on the shore of the lake with the towering peaks as witnesses and Sarah serving as the sole member of their wedding party. Do you, Daniel Peterson, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? I do, Daniel said, his voice strong and clear, his eyes never leaving Ruth's face. And do you, Ruth Reed, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? I do, Ruth replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel's kiss was different from their first tentative embrace by the fireplace. This was the kiss of a man claiming his bride, of a woman embracing her chosen future, of two people who had found in each other not just love, but a true partnership that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The celebration that followed was modest but joyful, a feast prepared from the best of their stored provisions, toasts made with elderberry wine that Daniel had been saving for a special occasion, dancing to music provided by Sarah's enthusiastic, if slightly off-key singing. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ruth felt as if she were living in a dream too wonderful to be real. But it was real, she reminded herself as she and Daniel walked hand in hand along the shore of the lake, while Sarah chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. This happiness, this sense of belonging, this love that had grown from the ashes of her former life, it was all real, all hers, all earned through the courage to trust in the possibility of second chances. As summer progressed, Ruth settled into her new role as Daniel's wife with a contentment that surprised her with its depth. The routines of their life together took on new meaning, now that they were officially bound to each other. The garden they tended together would feed their family. The improvements they made to the cabin were investments in their shared future. The quiet conversations they shared in the evenings were the foundation of a partnership that would last the rest of their lives. It was during one of these peaceful summer evenings that their tranquility was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Ruth felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized the familiar pattern. Multiple riders, moving with purpose rather than the casual pace of travelers. Daniel was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the rifle that was never far from reach. "Take Sarah to the back room," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had held during the confrontation the previous autumn. But this time, Ruth found herself reluctant to hide. She was no longer the desperate widow who had fled Cedar Ridge in shame and fear. She was Daniel Peterson's wife, mistress of this mountain home, a woman who had found her strength and her place in the world. Whatever these visitors wanted, she would face it standing beside her husband. "No," she said firmly. "Sarah can hide if she needs to, but I'm staying with you." Daniel looked as if he wanted to argue, but something in Ruth's expression must have convinced him that she meant what she said. He nodded curtly, then moved to the window to assess the approaching threat. 4 riders, he reported, moving fast, armed. Ruth's heart sank as she recognized the implications. This wasn't a casual visit or even a repeat of the previous year's intimidation attempt. 4 armed men riding hard toward their isolated cabin could only mean serious trouble. The riders came to a halt in front of the cabin, their horses snorting and stamping in the evening air. Ruth could see them clearly through the window, rough-looking men with the hard faces of those accustomed to violence. Their leader, a tall man with a graying beard, dismounted and approached the porch with the confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. "Peterson," he called out, "we know you're in there. Come out and face what you've done." Daniel opened the door but remained in the doorway, his rifle held casually but ready for use. "What I've done is build a home and live peacefully on my own land," he said. If you have a problem with that, state your business and move on. The bearded man laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Your business is with the law, Peterson, and with decent folks who won't stand by and watch you corrupt a good woman with your mountain man ways. Ruth felt anger flare in her chest at the accusation. Corrupt her? These men had no idea what corruption looked like. They should visit Cedar Ridge and see how the decent folks there treated a widow in need. I'm not corrupted, she said, stepping out onto the porch beside Daniel, despite his gesture for her to stay back. I'm married to this man by choice, and I won't stand here and listen to you insult him or our life together. The bearded man's eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, her clean dress, her healthy color, the confidence in her bearing that spoke of a woman who was well cared for and content with her circumstances. Married? He said mockingly. By what preacher? What church? Or did you just decide to call it marriage to make your sin more palatable? By Preacher Williams of the Methodist Circuit, Ruth replied firmly, with proper vows and legal documentation. Not that it's any of your business. The man's confidence wavered slightly at this news. Whatever he had expected to find, it clearly wasn't a legally married couple living in obvious domestic harmony. Even so, he said, recovering his bluster, there's the matter of what you took when you left Cedar Ridge. Property that doesn't belong to you, debts that haven't been paid. Ruth felt confusion wash over her. What property? What debts? She had left town with nothing but the clothes on her back and a few personal possessions. I took nothing that wasn't mine, she said. I owed nothing but a few dollars to the boarding house, which I left money to cover. What about the jewelry? The man demanded. The gold locket that belonged to Mrs. Henderson? She says you stole it from her shop the day you left town. Ruth's mouth fell open in shock. A gold locket? She had never seen any such thing, had never even been inside Mrs. Henderson's shop except for that one humiliating encounter when she had begged for work. I never stole anything from anyone, she said, her voice shaking with indignation. Mrs. Henderson refused to give me work and suggested I try the saloon. I left her shop empty-handed and never went back. That's not how she tells it, the bearded man said. She says you were desperate enough to steal, and that makes you a thief in the eyes of the law. Daniel stepped forward, his presence radiating controlled menace. And I suppose Mrs. Henderson sent you all the way up here out of the goodness of her heart, just to see justice done? The man's face flushed slightly. She's offering a reward for the return of her property, a substantial reward. Ah, Daniel said, his voice dripping with contempt. Now we get to the truth. This isn't about justice or stolen property. This is about bounty hunters looking to collect easy money by terrorizing an innocent woman. Innocent? The man laughed harshly. She's a thief and a whore who ran off to the mountains to avoid facing the consequences of her actions. The words were barely out of his mouth before Daniel moved, covering the distance between them in 2 quick strides. His fist connected with the man's jaw with a sound like an axe hitting wood, sending the bounty hunter staggering backward. That's my wife you're talking about, Daniel said quietly, his voice more dangerous for its calm tone. And if you ever speak of her that way again, I'll kill you where you stand. The other 3 men had their weapons drawn now. The situation balanced on a knife's edge between tense confrontation and deadly violence. Ruth felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized how quickly their peaceful life had been transformed into a scene from a nightmare. Easy, Peterson, one of the other men said. We didn't come here for a fight. We just want what's ours and we'll be on our way. There's nothing here that's yours, Daniel replied, not taking his eyes off the bearded man, who was wiping blood from his split lip. My wife is innocent of any wrongdoing, and you have no authority to take her anywhere. We have a warrant, the bearded man said, producing a folded paper from his coat. Signed by the territorial judge. That gives us all the authority we need. Ruth felt the bottom drop out of her world. A warrant. How could there be a warrant for her arrest when she had done nothing wrong? But even as the thought formed, she realized how naive it was. If Mrs. Henderson was willing to pay for her return, if she was determined to see Ruth punished for the crime of finding happiness outside the narrow confines of Cedar Ridge society, then finding a corrupt judge to sign a warrant would be a simple matter. Let me see that, Daniel said, extending his hand for the paper. The bearded man hesitated, then handed it over with obvious reluctance. Daniel unfolded it and read quickly, his expression growing darker with each line. "This is garbage," he said finally, tossing the paper back. "A warrant based on the uncorroborated word of a single accuser, signed by a judge who's probably never been within 50 miles of Cedar Ridge. It wouldn't hold up in any real court of law." "Maybe not," the bearded man said, his confidence returning now that his lip had stopped bleeding. "But it's enough to take her back for questioning. And once she's in custody, well, these things have a way of working themselves out." Ruth understood the threat perfectly. Once they got her back to Cedar Ridge, away from Daniel's protection, it would be her word against Mrs. Henderson's. And in a town where she had already been branded as an undesirable, where her desperate search for work had been turned into entertainment for the gossips, she would have little chance of proving her innocence. "She's not going anywhere with you," Daniel said flatly. "Warrant or no warrant, I won't let you take my wife." "Then you'll be obstructing justice," the bearded man said with a cruel smile. "That's a crime too, Peterson. We can take you both back in chains if that's how you want to play it." The standoff stretched taut between them, 4 armed men against 1, with Ruth and Sarah's safety hanging in the balance. Ruth could see the calculations running through Daniel's mind. The odds, the risks, the possible outcomes of a fight that could only end in bloodshed. It was then that she made a decision that surprised even herself. "I'll come with you," she said quietly. "Ruth, no," Daniel said immediately, turning to face her with alarm written across his features. "I'll come with you," she repeated, her voice growing stronger. "But not as your prisoner. I'll come as a free woman who chooses to face these false accusations and clear her name once and for all." The bearded man looked suspicious of this easy victory. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Ruth said, stepping forward with her chin raised in defiance. "I'm tired of running from lies and cowards. If Mrs. Henderson wants to accuse me of theft, let her do it in open court where everyone can hear the truth. But I go as Daniel Peterson's wife, under his protection, and I return here when my name is cleared." "Ruth," Daniel said again, his voice tight with worry, "you don't have to do this. We can fight them here, or we can disappear deeper into the mountains where they'll never find us." Ruth turned to face her husband, seeing the love and fear warring in his gray eyes. "I can't spend the rest of my life running from shadows," she said softly, "and I won't let them turn our home into a fortress under siege. This ends now, one way or another." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, and Ruth could see him recognizing something in her expression. The same strength that had carried her through Thomas's death and the cruel rejection of Cedar Ridge. The same determination that had allowed her to accept his offer of sanctuary and build a new life in the mountains. She was no longer the desperate widow who had begged for work and been mocked for her troubles. She was a woman who had found her power and was prepared to use it. "If you're determined to do this," he said finally, "then I'm coming with you." "Daniel, no," Ruth protested. "Sarah needs you here, and—" "Sarah comes with us," Daniel interrupted. "All of us, or none of us. That's the deal." The bearded man looked as if he wanted to object, but something in Daniel's tone warned him that this was not negotiable. "Fine," he said grudgingly, "but any tricks, any attempts to escape, and the deal's off." "No tricks," Ruth said firmly. "Just the truth." The journey back to Cedar Ridge took 2 days, and with every mile they traveled, Ruth felt her resolve strengthen. She was no longer fleeing in shame and desperation, no longer the broken woman who had left this place with nothing but the clothes on her back. She was returning as Daniel Peterson's wife, with her head held high and her conscience clear, ready to face whatever accusations awaited her. Daniel rode beside her, his presence a constant source of strength and reassurance. Sarah, initially frightened by the sudden disruption of their peaceful life, had adapted with the resilience of childhood, turning the journey into an adventure and chattering excitedly about seeing the town again. When they finally rode into Cedar Ridge, Ruth was struck by how small and shabby it looked compared to the grandeur of the mountains. The buildings that had once seemed so imposing now appeared cramped and mean. The streets that had witnessed her humiliation now looked narrow and confining. She had grown used to wide skies and towering peaks, to the clean air and honest work of mountain life. This place felt like a prison she had somehow escaped. News of their arrival spread quickly through the small town, and by the time they reached the sheriff's office, a crowd had gathered to witness the return of the widow who had dared to find happiness outside their narrow definition of respectability. Ruth could see familiar faces in the crowd, people who had turned away when she begged for work, who had whispered behind her back about her desperate circumstances, who had treated her like a pariah simply because she had been unfortunate enough to lose her husband. But she also saw something new in their expressions, a grudging respect, perhaps, or at least curiosity about the transformation that was evident in her appearance. The desperate, hollow-cheeked woman who had left Cedar Ridge in shame had been replaced by someone who radiated health and confidence, who carried herself with the dignity of a woman who knew her own worth. Sheriff Morrison, no relation to the man who had come to the cabin, was a fair-minded individual who had always treated Ruth with basic courtesy even during her darkest days. He looked uncomfortable as he greeted their party, clearly unhappy about the situation he had been forced into. "Mrs. Peterson," he said, using her married name with deliberate emphasis, "I'm sorry about this whole business. I want you to know that I have serious doubts about the charges against you." "Thank you, Sheriff," Ruth replied. "I appreciate your fairness. I'm ready to face whatever accusations have been made and prove my innocence." The hearing was held in the town's small courthouse, with Judge Whitman presiding. Ruth had met the judge briefly during her first days in Cedar Ridge. He had been a friend of Thomas's and had expressed genuine sympathy for her loss. She hoped that connection would serve her well now. Mrs. Henderson took the stand first, her testimony delivered with the righteous indignation of a woman who believed her own lies. She claimed that Ruth had stolen a valuable gold locket from her shop, that she had seen her take it on the day she left town, that the theft was clearly motivated by desperation and criminal intent. But as Ruth listened to the woman's accusations, she began to notice inconsistencies in the story, details that didn't match her memory of that humiliating encounter, descriptions of her behavior that rang false, claims about the value and appearance of the supposed stolen locket that seemed designed to inflate the seriousness of the crime. When it came time for Ruth's defense, Daniel stood beside her as she took the stand, his presence lending her strength as she faced the crowd of townspeople who had gathered to witness her trial. She told her story simply and honestly, her desperate search for work, the cruel rejection she had faced at every turn, the humiliating encounter with Mrs. Henderson that had ended with the suggestion that she try the saloon. "I never stole anything from anyone," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I left Cedar Ridge with nothing but my personal belongings and my daughter. I had no need to steal. Mr. Peterson had already offered us a home and honest work." Judge Whitman listened carefully to both sides, his expression thoughtful as he weighed the evidence. When both testimonies were complete, he called for a brief recess to consider his verdict. It was during this recess that the truth finally emerged. Sarah, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, tugged on Daniel's sleeve and whispered something in his ear. Daniel's expression changed dramatically, and he quickly made his way to the front of the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, "I believe my daughter has information relevant to this case." Judge Whitman looked surprised but nodded for Sarah to approach. The little girl walked to the front of the courtroom with the fearless confidence of childhood, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the room as she spoke. "The lady is lying," Sarah said, pointing at Mrs. Henderson. "I saw her put the pretty necklace in Mama's basket when she wasn't looking. Then she took it out again after we left and laughed about it." A murmur ran through the courtroom as the implications of Sarah's words sank in. Mrs. Henderson's face went white, then red, as she realized that her carefully constructed lie was crumbling around her. "That's impossible," she sputtered. "The child is mistaken, or she's been coached to lie." But Judge Whitman was studying Sarah with the careful attention of a man who had spent years learning to distinguish truth from falsehood. "Tell me exactly what you saw, child," he said gently. Sarah's account was detailed and consistent, delivered with the matter-of-fact honesty that only children possess. She described how Mrs. Henderson had pretended to be kind while Ruth was distracted by her humiliation, how she had slipped the locket into Ruth's basket, then retrieved it after they left the shop. Most damning of all, she repeated the words she had heard Mrs. Henderson speak to her assistant. Now we'll see how long it takes the desperate widow to notice what she's carrying. The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs as the full scope of Mrs. Henderson's deception became clear. She had deliberately planted evidence on Ruth, then waited for the right moment to spring her trap. The whole scheme had been designed not just to humiliate Ruth further, but to provide an excuse for bringing her back to Cedar Ridge, where she could be properly punished for the crime of finding happiness. Judge Whitman called for order, his expression stern as he addressed Mrs. Henderson. "These are very serious accusations, madam. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Mrs. Henderson's composure finally cracked completely. "She deserved it," she shrieked, her voice shrill with frustrated rage. "Running off to live in sin with that mountain man, thumbing her nose at decent society. Someone had to make her pay for her shameless behavior." The admission sealed her fate. Judge Whitman's verdict was swift and decisive. All charges against Ruth were dismissed, and Mrs. Henderson was ordered to pay substantial fines for filing false charges and attempting to pervert the course of justice. More importantly, she was publicly disgraced in front of the entire town, her reputation destroyed by her own vindictive actions. As they left the courthouse, Ruth felt a sense of vindication that went beyond mere legal victory. The town that had rejected her so cruelly was now forced to acknowledge her innocence, to admit that their treatment of her had been unjust and undeserved. She had faced her accusers and emerged victorious, not through luck or charity, but through the strength of her own character and the love of the family that stood beside her. The crowd that had gathered to witness her humiliation was now silent, many faces showing shame as people remembered their own role in driving a good woman to desperation. Some approached her as they walked toward the horses, offering awkward apologies and belated expressions of sympathy for her loss. Ruth accepted their words graciously, but without warmth. She had learned too much about human nature to trust in sudden reversals of opinion, and she had no desire to rebuild bridges that had been burned so thoroughly. Her life was in the mountains now, with Daniel and Sarah, far from the petty cruelties and social hierarchies that governed places like Cedar Ridge. As they prepared to leave town for the final time, Sheriff Morrison approached them with an expression of genuine regret. "Mrs. Peterson," he said, "I want to apologize for the way this town treated you. You deserved better, and I'm sorry I didn't do more to help when you needed it." "Thank you, Sheriff," Ruth replied. "I appreciate your honesty. But that life is behind me now. I have everything I need in the mountains." The sheriff nodded, understanding that she was closing a chapter of her life that had brought nothing but pain and struggle. "If you ever need anything," he said, "you know where to find me." As they rode out of Cedar Ridge for the last time, Ruth felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The fear that had haunted her since leaving town, the fear that she would somehow be forced to return to that life of desperation and rejection, was finally gone. She had faced her past and conquered it, proving to herself and everyone else that she was stronger than the circumstances that had once threatened to destroy her. The journey back to their mountain home took on the quality of a victory parade, with Sarah chattering excitedly about their adventure and Daniel riding beside Ruth with obvious pride in his wife's courage and dignity. When they finally crested the ridge that overlooked their valley, Ruth felt her heart soar at the sight of their cabin nestled beside the crystal-clear lake, smoke curling from the chimney in welcome. "Home," she said softly, the word carrying more meaning than it ever had before. "Home," Daniel agreed, reaching over to take her hand as they rode down into the valley that had become their sanctuary. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Ruth reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than 2 years ago, she had been a desperate widow begging for work on the streets of Cedar Ridge, mocked and rejected by people who saw her only as a burden to be cast aside. Now she was a woman who had found love, dignity, and purpose in the most unexpected of places. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Leaving the conventional life behind for this wilderness existence?" Ruth considered the question seriously, thinking about all she had gained and lost in choosing this path. She had given up the security of town life, the social connections and cultural opportunities that civilization provided. But in return, she had found something far more valuable. A love built on mutual respect and shared hardship. A home where she was valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. A life that was authentic and meaningful in ways that her previous existence had never been. Never, she said firmly. This is where I belong, with you and Sarah, building something real and lasting. The town may have its comforts, but it also has its cruelties. Here in the mountains, we're free to be ourselves, to live according to our own values rather than someone else's expectations. Daniel squeezed her hand, his gray eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. I love you, Ruth Peterson, he said, more than I ever thought possible to love another human being. And I love you, she replied, marveling at how easily the words came now, how natural it felt to speak of love and commitment and shared futures. You saved me, Daniel, not just from poverty or desperation, but from losing faith in the possibility of happiness. We saved each other, Daniel corrected gently. You brought life and warmth and purpose to this place. Before you came, I was just existing, just marking time until death finally caught up with me. Now I have reasons to build, to plan, to hope for tomorrow. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ruth thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. If Mrs. Henderson had shown her even basic human kindness, if the town had offered her honest work instead of mockery and rejection, she might never have been desperate enough to accept Daniel's offer. In trying to destroy her, her enemies had inadvertently led her to the greatest happiness she had ever known. Do you think we'll ever see them again? Sarah asked, appearing on the porch in her nightgown, ready for bed. The people from town? Probably not, sweetheart, Ruth said, gathering her daughter into her arms. And that's perfectly fine with me. We have everything we need right here. Sarah nodded solemnly, then brightened. I like it better here anyway. The mountains are prettier than buildings, and Daniel knows all the best places to find berries and interesting rocks. Ruth laughed, delighting in her daughter's simple wisdom. Children, she had learned, were remarkably adaptable, able to find joy and adventure in circumstances that might seem limiting to adults. Sarah had thrived in their mountain home, growing strong and confident under Daniel's patient guidance and the freedom to explore the wilderness that surrounded them. As the years passed, their life in the mountains took on the comfortable rhythm of established routine, punctuated by seasonal changes and the small adventures that marked the passage of time in the wilderness. Ruth became an expert at preserving food, managing their household, and adapting to the challenges of mountain living. Daniel taught her to hunt and fish, to read weather signs and animal tracks, to navigate by stars and landmarks. Sarah grew from a curious 6-year-old into a capable young woman who was as comfortable in the wilderness as any mountain-born child. Daniel proved to be an excellent teacher, sharing not only his practical knowledge of survival and self-sufficiency, but also his love of books and learning. Their cabin became a place where education happened naturally, woven into the fabric of daily life rather than confined to formal lessons. The circuit preacher continued to visit them each spring, bringing news of the outside world and performing whatever religious ceremonies they required. Through him, they learned that Cedar Ridge had undergone significant changes in the years following Ruth's vindication. Mrs. Henderson had been forced to sell her shop and leave town in disgrace, her reputation destroyed by her own vindictive actions. Several other prominent citizens had faced their own reckonings as the town gradually acknowledged the injustices they had perpetrated against those less fortunate. But these distant events seemed to belong to another world, one that had little relevance to the life Ruth and Daniel had built together in their mountain sanctuary. They had created something that was entirely their own, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared labor, a home that reflected their values and priorities, a family bound together by love rather than mere obligation or social convention. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching another spectacular mountain sunset, Ruth found herself thinking about the woman she had been when she first arrived in this valley. That desperate widow seemed like a stranger now. Someone from a half-remembered dream of struggle and desperation. The woman she had become, strong, confident, deeply loved and loving in return, felt like her true self, the person she had always been meant to be. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, noticing her contemplative mood. "I was thinking about how different I am now from the woman who first came here," Ruth said. "Sometimes I can barely remember what it felt like to be so desperate, so afraid of the future." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "You were never weak," he said. "Even then, when you thought you had nothing left, you had the courage to keep fighting for your daughter, to keep looking for a way forward. That's what I fell in love with first. Your strength, even when you couldn't see it yourself." Ruth leaned against his shoulder, comfortable in the familiar warmth of his presence. "I used to think happiness was something that happened to other people," she said. "Something I might glimpse from a distance, but never experience myself. I never imagined it could be this simple, this solid, this lasting." "Simple doesn't mean easy," Daniel observed. "We've worked hard for this life, faced challenges that would have broken weaker people, but we've faced them together, and that's made all the difference." As if to prove his point, Sarah emerged from the cabin carrying a tray with 3 cups of coffee, her movements graceful and sure despite the gathering darkness. At 16, she had grown into a young woman who combined her mother's determination with Daniel's quiet strength, equally comfortable discussing philosophy or skinning a deer, planting a garden, or navigating by the stars. "Are you two getting sentimental again?" she asked with the gentle teasing that marked their family's comfortable dynamic. "Always," Ruth said with a laugh. "It's one of the privileges of getting older, the right to be sentimental about the good things in life." Sarah settled beside them on the porch, her own cup warming her hands as she looked out over the lake that had become as familiar as her own reflection. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't come here?" she asked. "If we had stayed in town and tried to make it work somehow?" Ruth considered the question seriously. It was impossible to know, of course, but she suspected their lives would have been marked by struggle and compromise, by the constant effort to fit into a society that had already judged them unworthy of acceptance. "I think we would have survived," she said finally. "We're survivors, all of us. But I don't think we would have thrived the way we have here. This place, this life, it's allowed us to become the best versions of ourselves." Daniel reached over to take her hand, his touch as warm and reassuring as it had been on that first night when he had offered them sanctuary. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing the question he had posed on their first evening back from Cedar Ridge. "None," Ruth said firmly. "Not a single one." As they sat together in the peaceful darkness, listening to the gentle lap of water against the shore and the distant call of a loon, Ruth felt a deep satisfaction settle over her like a comfortable blanket. She had traveled a long road from that desperate night when she had stood outside Mrs. Henderson's shop, begging for work and facing nothing but mockery and rejection. The journey had required courage she hadn't known she possessed, had demanded that she trust in possibilities she couldn't see, had asked her to believe in the kindness of a stranger when all evidence suggested that kindness was in short supply. But the journey had led her here, to this place of peace and plenty, to this family bound together by love and mutual respect, to this life that was exactly what she would have chosen if she had been brave enough to dream of such happiness. The poor widow who had begged for work and been mocked for her desperation had found something far more valuable than employment. She had found a home, a purpose, and a love that would sustain her for the rest of her days. The mountain man who had called her his wife had given her more than just his name and protection. He had given her back her dignity, her strength, and her faith in the possibility of second chances. Together they had built something that would endure long after the petty cruelties and social hierarchies of places like Cedar Ridge had been forgotten. A love story written in the language of shared labor and mutual respect. A family forged in the crucible of hardship and sealed by the unbreakable bonds of chosen commitment. As the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance and the mountains stood sentinel around their small valley, Ruth Peterson closed her eyes and smiled, knowing that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the people she was meant to love, living exactly the life she was meant to live. The journey from desperation to joy had been long and difficult, but it had led her home at last.